U.S. President Donald Trump says negotiators are getting closer to securing a deal that could end the war in Ukraine. The comment came after he wrapped up nearly 3 hours of talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in Florida. Both leaders spoke to reporters, describing the meeting as promising. But Trump also said that there are still, quote, one or two very thorny issues remaining.
Well, we made a lot of progress today, but really we've made it over the last month. This is not a one-day process deal. This is very complicated stuff. But I think when the president says 95, I think, could be close to 95%.
No, we spoke about 20 points planned, and I'm happy that really our team's very close to results. And I agree with President Trump that our teams worked not one day and not one week, more than 1 month, beginning from Geneva, then 2 meetings in Miami, then we had Berlin, and now we have Mar-a-Lago.
Zelenskyy and Trump say they also spoke to the EU leaders by phone. Trump spoke to Russian President Vladimir Putin shortly before meeting with Zelenskyy, and he said he would speak to the Russian leader again after this meeting. To understand more on what came out of the talks today, we reached journalist Ira Spitzer.
Well, one thing that was interesting was President Trump saying that the phone call that he held with Russian President Vladimir Putin before he met with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy was 2.5 hours long. That is quite a long phone call. So that was one revelation that came out of that press conference. And I suppose that would be some indication of potentially how serious this meeting was being viewed by the Russian side, how important it is, which would give some credence to the idea that there is the potential for some kind of agreement. And as President Trump optimistically said, that if things go well, we could hear about some more details in the next few weeks. But then, of course, saying that it's just as likely that things could fall apart, although the overall tone was optimistic here. But as far as the thorny issues, such as the territorial concerns, both leaders, and especially President Trump, saying that the issue of the Donbass, that territory in the east of Ukraine that is being fought over, it's Ukraine's territory, but Russia has taken lots of that territory during this almost 4-year-old war and would like to take more. President Trump saying that issue hasn't yet been resolved. So we'll see if we have any more updates there. And then it was also interesting the talk about the actual process of taking this potentially to a referendum among Ukrainian citizens, and then just some of the logistical difficulties that we could see trying to organize a referendum that was viewed as fair and comprehensive to actually hash out these thorny issues in that way. So that's certainly something that we haven't heard the last of. So notable, though, that right after the meeting between President Trump and President Zelenskyy, then you had this whole cohort of European leaders, including the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and NATO's leader and all of these people on the call immediately after that meeting. So just a flurry of diplomacy, if you think about it, today with the calls between Putin and Trump, and then all of those European leaders folded into this meeting between President Trump and President Zelenskyy.
That was journalist Ira Spitzer in San Francisco. For his perspective on these developments, we're joined now by Andrew Rasulis in Ottawa. He's a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a retired Department of National Defense official. Andrew, thank you as always for making time for us.
Good evening, Deanna.
Andrew, we have been following these developments, the many meetings hoping to achieve peace in Ukraine. What do you make of what we've learned about today's meeting, which U.S. President Donald Trump described at one point as, quote, excellent?
Well, to me, there is one major breakthrough, actually, which is not getting much play, but Trump described it and Zelenskyy talked about it a bit, is the establishment of a process that now moves forward from today. And that process involves working groups. It'll involve Russian working groups, American, and Ukrainian. Now, the modalities are not yet clear, how they will meet, when they will meet, but Trump already went down a list of people that he's going to have as his senior representatives on his working group, the American working group. And Zelensky said, of course, he's going to have to work out who he's going to have on his. Now, in the earlier conversation that Trump had with Putin today, they also agreed on working groups. So we know that the Russians are interested in certainly bilateral working groups with the United States, but one can assume, but we have to wait for the next follow-on conversation that Trump is probably having with Putin as we speak about including the Ukrainians. But I think the process is very important. We have now, for the first time, a potential trilateral negotiating ongoing process, not at the summit level, but at officials levels to really work it through.
That is, thank you so much for highlighting that. And just to be clear, we have never gotten this far in the past, correct? Towards taking things out of the abstract and into the practical.
Exactly. And we've never had, like as Trump said in his press conference today, we're all negotiating amongst ourselves. So it's time to negotiate with the Russians. And I think that's the breakthrough. And as Trump said, and we're echoing, there's no guarantee of success here. But we have not, as you just said, Deanna, we've never been this far. Having been this far is not a guarantee of success, but it shows there's a prospect of success. The alternative, of course, is just continual warfare.
Which Donald Trump pointed out as well. Look, Andrew, we've talked about this many, many times, which is the whole point of territorial concessions. Will Ukraine have to make them, and how big will those concessions have to be? Trump announced that there was a lot of progress towards ending the war today, but he did mention that there are thorny points, and we can assume that some of those thorny points involve territorial concessions. Let's talk a little bit about one of these big issues, as Donald Trump put it, remaining. How critical will these issues be in potential negotiations with Russia?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so the Donbass settlement is fundamental to this. So the Russians have insisted all along they want to have control over the full oblast of the Donetsk, which means that fortress belt. Now, the talks so far suggest there could be this thing called a demilitarized zone in lieu of actually Russian forces occupying it and Ukrainian forces leaving it. And there are multiple variants there. The Russians have floated ideas that their troops would not go forward, but they would put police forces and National Guard in that area. So, of course, that's what the negotiations are about. But to say that the Ukrainians are going to hold on to the Donetsk fortress belt and the Russians will agree to that, I can't. That's a non-starter for the Russians. So there'll have to be this demilitarized zone or some kind of nuance where the Ukrainians are going to have to walk back. Otherwise, I think it's a deal breaker.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the chat we've had that Donald Trump mentioned actually before they went into that meeting about a potential deal regarding precious minerals, that rare minerals that Ukraine has, and how this would be an advantage to Ukraine economically. They didn't talk much about it coming out of the meeting, but it certainly looks like there's some sort of U.S. economic interest or energy interest in Ukraine in order for U.S. to provide some security guarantees. What stood out for you on that front? Yeah,
thank you for that, because the other part of this is economics. There's the security side, the political side, but economics. There is the economic, I would say, incentive. This is not pressure stuff. This is economic incentives for the Ukrainians to sign a deal that they may not like very much, but they will benefit economically from it. And Trump just threw out that minerals deal as an example. But we also know from conversations that the Americans have had with the Russians, they are also interested in having bilateral economic progress with Russia, like lifting sanctions and establishing a more normalized American-Russian economic situation. So there's an incentive for the Russians to actually make some kind of deal as well. So both sides, the idea is both sides benefit economically by making a deal. The key is, what kind of deal will that be? But yes, economics are a very important incentive, not a pressure tactic here.
So we do know that it's down to 20 points now from the original 26 or 28. The ones that were absolutely unacceptable to Ukraine, such as it not having a standing army, basically, as something that was in that original iteration of the document, seems to be off the table now. We know that NATO leaders and European leaders have largely signed off on whatever this iteration of the plan is. Talk to me a little bit about where do we move next in terms of having the consent of Ukrainian people who have sacrificed so much, who've lost so many people in this war, and the logistical difficulty in frankly holding a referendum, and so many of them in the diaspora, so many of Ukrainians who had to leave the country. Do you see this as a feasible next step, or do you think it's something that the Ukrainian parliament is going to have to deal with?
Exactly. I mean, Trump mentioned that in the press conference. That's the alternative option. And that's the far more pragmatic one. Yes, the Ukrainians have to have a voice, but does it have to be a one-to-one voice? Every individual Ukrainian citizen votes, or because of the impracticalities of that, requiring a ceasefire, which the Russians would not agree to, and also the timeline to actually do that, can't do that quickly. I think that's really also impractical, but having the Ukrainian parliament vote and speak for the Ukrainian people is the way to go. And I think that's what has been talked about today at the press conference. And I think that's probably what the working groups will focus on.
Andrew, thank you so much for this analysis and all of your analyses during the past year. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Deanna.
That was Andrew Rasulis in Ottawa.